They say when a head is severed, the brain can stay conscious for nearly 30 seconds. 30 seconds where the eyes still blink, the lips still move, and awareness lingers as life slips away. For Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's doomed queen, those seconds became legend. But Anne's death was more than a beheading. It was theater, a stage-managed spectacle of blood and silence, meant not just to kill her, but to obliterate her memory. This is the story of how a queen went from wearing a crown to kneeling on the scaffold, and why, nearly 5 centuries later, her execution still haunts England's history. The rise from courtier's daughter to queen. To understand Anne's destruction, we must first understand her ascent. Born in either 1501 or 1507, the exact date lost to history's shadows, Anne Boleyn was the daughter of an ambitious courtier, Thomas Boleyn. She was not born to be queen. She was educated to be a weapon. At just 11 years old, Anne was sent to the courts of Europe, first to the Netherlands under Margaret of Austria, then to France under Queen Claude. For nearly a decade, she learned the deadly arts of Renaissance diplomacy, how to speak multiple languages, how to dance with grace, how to wield wit like a blade, and most dangerously of all, how to make kings desire what they could not have. In 1522, Anne returned to England, transformed. She was no longer the courtier's daughter who had left. She was something new, something dangerous, a woman who understood power and how to claim it. Henry VIII first noticed her in 1526. He was already married to Catherine of Aragon, already growing frustrated with his lack of male heirs. Anne was serving as lady-in-waiting to the queen, the very woman she would eventually destroy. What happened next changed the course of English history. Henry didn't just want Anne as a mistress, he wanted her as his wife. And Anne, brilliant and calculating, refused to settle for anything less than a crown. For 6 years, she kept the King of England waiting. 6 years of passionate letters, of desperate courtship, of Henry turning the world upside down to make her his queen. He broke with Rome, declared himself head of the English Church, and dissolved a 1,000-year-old marriage. All for Anne Boleyn. On November 14, 1532, they were secretly married. Anne was already pregnant. Just 3 years before her execution, Anne was crowned at Westminster Abbey on June 4, 1533. Visibly pregnant, cheered through the streets of London as Henry's great love and England's new queen. The crowds threw rose petals, cannons fired in celebration. The future seemed golden. But the crown that elevated Anne also sealed her fate, the fall, when queens become inconvenient. By 1536, the fairy tale had curdled into nightmare. Anne had given Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, not the male heir he desperately needed. She had suffered at least 3 miscarriages, each one a personal tragedy and political disaster. The last miscarriage in January 1536 was particularly devastating. The lost child was a boy, the son Henry had demanded. Just days before that final miscarriage, 2 events shattered any remaining hope. On January 7, 1536, Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, died in exile. Her death should have legitimized Anne's position. Instead, it freed Henry to remarry without the complication of having 2 living wives. Then, on January 24, Henry took a catastrophic fall from his horse during a tournament. He lay unconscious for 2 hours while his court held its breath, fearing their king might die. When Henry awakened, something had changed. The jovial king had become paranoid, suspicious, cruel. Some historians believe the head injury altered his personality forever. The miscarriage followed within days. Anne, devastated and desperate, may have lashed out at Henry in ways that sealed her doom. Contemporary accounts suggest she accused Henry of killing their son through his infidelities, his cruelties, his emotional abandonment. It was a fatal miscalculation. Henry VIII did not tolerate criticism, especially from wives. By April 1536, Henry was already courting Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. The irony was bitter. Just as Anne had once served Catherine while stealing her husband's heart, now Jane served Anne while winning Henry's affections. But Henry faced a problem. How do you dispose of a crowned queen? Divorce would legitimize his first marriage and bastardize Elizabeth. Annulment would suggest his second marriage was invalid from the start. There was only one solution that served Henry's purposes. Anne Boleyn had to die. The trap, manufacturing treason. On April 24, 1536, just 8 days before Anne's arrest, Henry signed a commission that changed everything. He granted Thomas Cromwell, his chief minister, unlimited power to investigate the Queen. But the commission's language was telling. It didn't authorize Cromwell to discover the truth. It empowered him to end the mistress's trial. The verdict was predetermined. Now they just needed evidence. Cromwell was a master at manufacturing scandals. He constructed a case so outrageous it would have collapsed in any real court. Anne was accused of sleeping with 5 men, including her own brother George. The supposed lovers were carefully chosen: Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool and closest friend; William Brereton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber; Francis Weston, another courtier; Mark Smeaton, a lowly musician; and George Boleyn, Anne's beloved brother. The charges were absurd. Court records showed that on May 13, 1535, when Anne was supposedly committing adultery at Greenwich, she was actually at Richmond Palace, over 10 miles away. The timeline was impossible, the evidence fabricated, the witnesses either tortured or bribed. But Henry didn't need truth. He needed a narrative that would justify regicide and clear his path to wife number 3. Here's the most chilling detail. Henry had already signed Anne's death warrant before any investigation even began. This wasn't justice, it was judicial murder, planned with meticulous care. The Tower, 17 days of psychological torture. On May 10, 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested at Greenwich Palace during the May Day celebrations. The timing was deliberate, a public humiliation designed to shatter her dignity before destroying her life. They transported her by barge down the Thames to the Tower of London, the same fortress she had once entered in triumph before her coronation. The Tower's constable, Sir William Kingston, documented everything in letters that survive to this day, giving us an intimate glimpse into Anne's final weeks. In a cruel irony, they locked her in the exact same luxurious apartments where she'd stayed before her coronation 3 years earlier. The rooms that had once symbolized her elevation now became her prison. Every tapestry, every piece of furniture, every window view reminded her of what she had been and what she was about to lose. For 17 endless days, she waited. But this wasn't mere imprisonment, it was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. Henry repeatedly postponed her execution, granting stays not from mercy but from cruelty. Each delay forced Anne to prepare for death multiple times. The uncertainty itself became a form of torture, designed to break her mind before breaking her neck. Anne was never truly alone, but she was utterly isolated. 4 ladies-in-waiting attended her constantly: Lady Kingston, Lady Boleyn, her sister-in-law, Mrs. Coffin, and Mrs. Stoner. But these weren't companions, they were spies, reporting Anne's every word and gesture to Kingston, who relayed everything to Cromwell. The psychological pressure was immense. Kingston's letters describe a woman oscillating between hysteria and eerie calm. She fell into a great laughing, and has done so many times since. It wasn't joy, it was a woman's mind beginning to fracture under impossible stress. At 2 a.m. on the night before her execution, Anne requested the sacrament. She spent hours kneeling in prayer, whispering pleas to a God who seemed to have abandoned her. When dawn broke on May 19, 1536, witnesses found her alternating between nervous laughter and uncontrollable sobbing, the last remnants of her sanity slipping away. The trial, theater of the predetermined. On May 15, 1536, Anne faced her accusers in the Great Hall of the Tower. But this wasn't a trial, it was a performance with a script already written. 27 peers sat in judgment, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who would condemn his niece to save his own skin. The jury was packed with Henry's supporters and Anne's enemies. Justice was not just blind, it was gagged and bound. Anne defended herself with remarkable intelligence and dignity, answering each charge methodically, exposing the contradictions and impossibilities in the prosecution's case. But her eloquence was irrelevant. The verdict had been decided weeks earlier. Meanwhile, Henry was already planning his future. On the very morning of Anne's trial, he told Jane Seymour that Anne would be condemned that day. He was planning their wedding while his current wife was fighting for her life. The trial's outcome surprised no one. Guilty on all charges. The sentence, death by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. Even in condemnation, Henry's cruelty had limits, or perhaps his sense of theater demanded refinement. He commuted the sentence from burning to beheading, but with a twist that revealed his true intentions. The executioner, foreign hands for royal blood. Instead of using the traditional English axe and block, Henry insisted on bringing in a special executioner from France, an expert swordsman from Calais. Some called it mercy. The French method was supposedly swifter, more precise, less brutal than the clumsy English axe that might require multiple blows. But Henry's choice was theater, not compassion. Using foreign executioner sent deeper message. Anne Boleyn, despite being crowned Queen of England, was being marked as fundamentally other, not truly English, not deserving of English justice or English methods. It was one final humiliation orchestrated with Henry's characteristic attention to symbolic detail. The executioner was paid £23 for his work, equivalent to about £8,000 in today's money. A small fortune for a few seconds of skilled butchery. The performance, death as spectacle. On the morning of May 19, 1536, a grey, heavy sky dawned over the Tower of London, casting the fortress in dull, colourless light. The morning chill clung to the walls, curling into every corner like an omen. Below, in the inner courtyard of Tower Green, labourers had quietly assembled a scaffold of pale, freshly cut wood. Unlike the grand raised platforms used for common traitors, this scaffold was deliberately low, only 3 feet high. It was a calculated humiliation, forcing onlookers to look down at the kneeling queen, denying her even the dignity of height. Beside the scaffold lay a long, gleaming sword and its master, the executioner brought all the way from Calais. At 8 a.m., Anne received news that her execution had been postponed until noon, a cruel blow as she had already prepared herself psychologically for the end. The delay was vintage Henry, one last twist of the knife, one final moment of uncertainty to compound her suffering. By noon, when the drums finally began to sound, Anne had transformed herself one final time. She appeared dressed with careful symbolism, a grey fur mantle over a crimson silk petticoat, a simple white cap covering her famous dark hair. Every detail was performance, the colours of sacrifice, purity, and royal blood. Most witnesses removed their hats when Anne appeared. Despite everything, she walked to the scaffold with the dignity that had always characterized her. Her steps were measured, her bearing erect. She had been broken, but she would not be seen as broken. Anne's final speech was a masterpiece of survival strategy disguised as submission. She praised Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord. She submitted to the law, but listened carefully to her words. She never admitted guilt. Even at the end, facing the sword's edge, she refused to confess to crimes she had not committed. Before kneeling, Anne performed one last act of agency. She gave personal gifts to her attending ladies, small tokens of affection and remembrance. Then, in a gesture that stunned witnesses, she presented a purse of gold coins to her executioner, payment for a job she prayed would be well done. Anne knelt upright on the scaffold, no block beneath her head. She was blindfolded with a simple white cloth, her hands bound behind her back. As she began reciting prayers, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul," the executioner employed a calculated distraction. "Where is my sword?" he called out to his assistant. Anne turned her head instinctively toward the voice. In that moment of misdirection, thwack, one swift stroke fell. Her head dropped cleanly onto the wooden boards. Blood spurted across the platform, staining the pale wood dark. And yet witnesses swore they saw the impossible. Her lips continued moving in prayer. Her eyes fluttered open and closed. For those haunting 30 seconds that opened our story, Anne Boleyn may have remained aware as her life ebbed away. The executioner then lifted her head by the hair, proclaiming to the stunned crowd, "So perish all the king's enemies." But his voice carried uncertainty. The crowd's reaction was not the cheering Henry might have expected. Instead, an uneasy murmur rippled through the witnesses. They had just seen a queen murdered, and they knew it. Cannon fire echoed across London, the signal Henry had been waiting for. He was free to marry again. The erasure, rewriting history in real time. There was no coffin. Anne's sobbing ladies had to wrap her head and body in white cloth and place them in an old arrow chest, a container meant for storing arrows, not housing the remains of a queen. She was buried hastily in an unmarked grave beneath the stone floor of St. Peter ad Vincula, the chapel within the tower walls. No tombstone marked the spot. No effigy commemorated her reign. No funeral procession honored her memory. Anne Boleyn simply disappeared. Henry wasted no time capitalizing on his freedom. By sunset on May 19, the very day of Anne's execution, he was dressed in white and riding to meet Jane Seymour. Exactly 10 days later, they were formally betrothed. 2 weeks after Anne's death, they were married. But Henry's erasure of Anne went far beyond remarriage. He ordered that all portraits of Anne be destroyed, her heraldic emblems removed from royal buildings, her name struck from official records. Courtiers learned to speak Anne's name less and less until it became dangerous to speak it at all. This was damnatio memoria, the systematic destruction of memory practiced by Roman emperors against their enemies. Anne Boleyn was not just executed, she was unmade from history itself. The erasure was so effective that to this day, there exists no definitively authenticated contemporary portrait of Anne Boleyn. We know her face only through later artistic interpretations and one small contemporary medal, the Most Happy Medal created for her coronation. Anne's execution didn't happen in isolation. Her brother George and the 4 men, accused of being her lovers, had already been executed on the same fabricated charges. This wasn't justice, it was a Tudor purge, a show trial centuries ahead of its time. The entire English establishment had collaborated in killing a woman they knew was innocent. Thomas Cromwell fabricated evidence. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury and Anne's former supporter, stayed silent. The nobility voted to convict their queen to save their own positions. Even Anne's own family, her father Thomas Boleyn, her uncle the Duke of Norfolk, abandoned her to protect themselves. The execution of Anne Boleyn broke something fundamental in the English understanding of justice. It proved that evidence could be manufactured, witnesses bought, and trials rigged when royal will demanded it. It established a precedent that would haunt English courts for generations. Among those who witnessed Anne's final moments was Thomas Wyatt, the poet who may have once been her lover. Imprisoned in the Bell Tower during her trial, he watched the executions from his cell window. Within days of her death, he wrote a heart-wrenching poem that captured the horror. "These bloody days have broken my heart. The Bell Tower showed me such sight that in my head sticks day and night." Another witness, Lancelot de Carlos, chaplain to the French ambassador, was so moved by Anne's death that he wrote a 1,018-line poem about her execution within 2 weeks. His account provides some of our most detailed descriptions of her final moments and the crowd's reaction. These contemporary voices matter because they provide evidence that Anne's innocence was widely recognized, even as the machinery of state ground forward with her destruction. Perhaps the most lasting victim of Anne's execution was her 3-year-old daughter Elizabeth. In one stroke, the future Elizabeth I lost her mother, her legitimacy, and her place in the succession. She was declared a bastard and would remain so for the next 9 years of Henry's reign. Elizabeth never spoke publicly about her mother's fate, but the trauma shaped her entire life. She would never marry, perhaps understanding that queens who wed became vulnerable to their husbands' whims. She kept a secret ring that opened to reveal hidden portraits of herself and Anne Boleyn, face to face, a private shrine to the mother she was forbidden to mourn. Would Elizabeth have become such an extraordinary ruler without that childhood trauma? We'll never know. But her greatest achievements, her fierce independence, her political brilliance, her ability to survive court intrigue, can all be traced back to lessons learned from her mother's destruction. Anne's execution sent shockwaves across Europe. Diplomatic correspondence from the time reveals widespread disgust at Henry's actions. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V called it judicial murder. The French court, despite providing the executioner, was appalled by the manufactured charges. Even Protestant reformers who had supported Henry's break with Rome began to question whether they had backed a monster. The execution revealed Henry VIII not as a righteous king reforming religion, but as a tyrant who would kill anyone, including queens who inconvenienced him. Anne Boleyn's story didn't end with her burial. In 1876, renovation work at the Tower of London uncovered remains beneath the altar of St. Peter ad Vincula. The bones were examined by a doctor who determined they belonged to a woman between 25 and 30 years old, standing 5. The remains were reinterred with more dignity than Anne had received in life. Though some historians question whether the bones truly belonged to her, they might instead be those of Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, who was also beheaded at the Tower, or Lady Rochford, who was executed for her role in Catherine Howard's downfall. The uncertainty is fitting. Even in death, Anne Boleyn remains elusive, her truth obscured by centuries of propaganda and historical revision. Today, visitors to the Tower of London can find the spot where Anne's scaffold once stood, marked by a simple glass memorial on Tower Green. Admirers still lay roses there, red for the blood she shed, white for her claimed innocence. The memorial reads simply, "Site of Scaffold." It doesn't mention Anne by name, reflecting how thoroughly her erasure succeeded. Yet people come, they remember, they honor a woman whose name Henry VIII tried to write out of history. But here's the ultimate irony that Henry VIII could never have anticipated. Anne Boleyn won, the daughter he tried to disinherit. Elizabeth rose to become one of England's greatest monarchs. Elizabeth I ruled for 45 years, defended England against the Spanish Armada, presided over a golden age of literature and exploration, and died beloved by her people. Through Elizabeth, Anne's blood sits on every British throne to this day. The woman Henry tried to erase became the ancestor of every subsequent English monarch. Her genes, her intelligence, her fierce will to survive, all passed down through Elizabeth to shape the future of the English crown. Anne's execution was supposed to end her story. Instead, it began her daughter's legend. Anne Boleyn's execution stands as an eternal warning about the corruption of power. It shows us how propaganda can rewrite history, how courts can be perverted into theaters of predetermined outcomes, how even the most powerful women can be reduced to nothing more than performances on scaffolds. Her death teaches us that when authority figures manufacture evidence, pack juries, and silence dissent, justice dies along with the accused. When we allow power to determine truth rather than truth to limit power, we create the conditions for tyranny. Anne Boleyn wasn't simply executed for adultery or treason. She was killed for the same reason women throughout history have been destroyed. She had risen too high, spoken too boldly, claimed too much agency in a world that demanded female submission. Henry VIII wanted Anne Boleyn erased from history. Instead, her story has become immortal, a reminder that power's attempts to control truth are ultimately futile. Memory endures, truth survives, and the voices of the silenced eventually find ways to speak. Conclusion: the Queen unmade and remade. Anne Boleyn entered the Tower of London twice. The first time she came as a triumphant queen-to-be, preparing for her coronation. The second time she came as a condemned woman, preparing for her death. But there was a third entrance, metaphorical, invisible, lasting, through the pen of history, through the reign of her daughter, through the admiration of countless generations who recognize injustice when they see it. Anne Boleyn entered the realm of legend. Henry VIII succeeded in killing Anne Boleyn's body. He failed spectacularly in killing her memory. On that grey morning in May 1536, as the executioner's sword fell, and Anne's head rolled across the scaffold boards, Henry believed he was writing the final chapter of an inconvenient queen's story. He was wrong. He was writing the first chapter of a legend that would outlast his dynasty, his kingdom, and his name. Because Anne Boleyn wasn't simply executed, she was unmade. And then, by the force of her daughter's greatness and history's judgment, she was remade, not as Henry's victim, but as his conqueror. The crown that once sat on Anne Boleyn's head may have been torn away by royal will, but the crown of immortality that sits on her memory was placed there by justice itself, and no king, no matter how powerful, can remove what truth has crowned. In the end, Anne Boleyn achieved something Henry VIII never could. She became truly, permanently, unassailably royal, not by birth, not by marriage, not by coronation, but by the eternal recognition that she was a queen wronged, a woman destroyed, and a mother whose greatest vindication was yet to come. Her executioner raised her severed head and proclaimed, "So perish all the king's enemies." History raised her daughter to the throne and proclaimed, "So triumph all who are wrongly condemned." Anne Boleyn was erased. Anne Boleyn was forgotten. Anne Boleyn was unmade. And then Anne Boleyn was remembered forever.